The air in Washington city on August 24, 1814, was not merely hot. It was a physical weight. A suffocating, humid blanket stitched with the threads of dread and anticipation. From an upper window of the president's mansion, First Lady Dolley Madison held a spyglass to her eye, her knuckles white. The spyglass was a gift from her husband, a tool for observing ships on the Potomac. Today, she aimed it east, toward the little village of Bladensburg, searching not for merchant sails, but for the dust clouds of retreating soldiers, for the glint of a victorious American standard. For days, the capital had been a hornet's nest of rumor and fear. A powerful British fleet, having blockaded the Chesapeake for months, had finally landed an army of veterans, men hardened by the long Napoleonic Wars. They were marching inland, and the capital of the young, audacious republic was their target. President James Madison, a brilliant scholar and statesman, but no soldier, had ridden out towards the front lines that morning to observe the defense, leaving Dolley as the de facto guardian of their home and the nation's symbolic heart. Downstairs, the dining room was a picture of defiant optimism. A grand table was set for 40 guests, cabinet members, military officers, and their wives. Wine chilled in silver buckets. A feast of roasted meats, fresh vegetables, and fine desserts was being prepared in the kitchens. It was a dinner planned to celebrate a victory that had not yet been won. A quintessential American act of betting on a favorable future. But as the afternoon sun began its slow, merciless descent, the sounds that drifted back to the mansion were not the cheers of triumph. They were the low, guttural growls of distant cannon fire. Dolley's vigil at the window was interrupted by a rider, his horse lathered in sweat, his face a mask of crime and panic. He brought a hastily scrawled note from her husband. The words were a death knell to the day's hopes. "The militia are routed. Flee the city. Now." The president's mansion, a structure of pale Aquia Creek sandstone, was not yet the icon it would become. It was simply the president's home, a grand but vulnerable house at the center of a swampy, unfinished city. As the cannon fire grew louder, closer, the carefully constructed facade of civic order began to crumble. Government clerks frantically bundled priceless documents into linen sacks, tossing them into wagons. Terrified citizens, their belongings piled high on carts, streamed out of the city, clogging the bridge to Virginia. Chaos had arrived. Inside the mansion, Dolley Madison faced a choice that would define her legacy. Her guards urged her to save herself. Friends begged her to flee. But she would not go. Not yet. Her eyes fell on a full-length portrait of General Washington that dominated the state dining room. It was the famous Lansdowne portrait by Gilbert Stuart, a national treasure, a tangible link to the country's founding spirit. To Dolley, it was more than paint and canvas. It was the soul of the Republic. It could not, would not be allowed to fall into enemy hands as a trophy of war. "Save that portrait," she commanded, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Save it, if nothing else. It is more important than any of us." But the painting was massive and securely bolted to the wall. The frame was too large to fit through the doors. Time was evaporating. The staff, including the doorman Jean-Pierre Soussade and a young enslaved boy named Paul Jennings, worked feverishly. With the roar of the British advance now audible, a decision was made. "Break the frame," Dolley ordered. With an axe, they shattered the ornate golden frame. The canvas was carefully cut out, rolled up, and handed to two gentlemen from New York, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster, who spirited it away to safety just moments before the first British soldiers appeared at the edge of the city. Only then, with the ghost of Washington safe, did Dolley Madison gather her own few belongings, including the red velvet curtains from her drawing room, and climbed into her carriage. As she crossed the Potomac, she looked back. A column of ominous black smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of the Capitol building. The night of fire had begun. The Redcoats' revenge. The British forces that marched into Washington were led by Major General Robert Ross, a respected and professional soldier, but the spirit of the invasion was embodied by his second-in-command, Rear Admiral George Cockburn. Cockburn was a man nursing a grudge. He and his sailors had been raiding the Chesapeake coastline for months, and they held a deep contempt for the upstart Americans. More pointedly, they were here for revenge. A year earlier, American troops had captured and burned York, modern-day Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. The British Parliament building there had been torched, an act the British considered unforgivable vandalism. Now, it was time to repay the favor, to strike a blow that would humiliate the American government and cripple its morale. The Battle of Bladensburg had been a catastrophic failure for the Americans. Their lines, mostly composed of ill-trained and terrified militia, had collapsed in the face of a disciplined British charge. The engagement was so one-sided, it was mockingly dubbed the Bladensburg Races, as the American defenders fled almost as soon as the fighting began. As Ross and Cockburn rode into the eerily deserted streets of Washington, they found a capital city ripe for the taking. Their first target was the magnificent two-winged Capitol building, home to the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the Library of Congress. The soldiers stormed the building, marveling at its neoclassical grandeur, before setting about their destructive work. Admiral Cockburn, a man of theatrical cruelty, took a particular delight in the proceedings. He climbed into the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives and mockingly posed a question to the empty chamber. "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned? All for it will say aye." A roar of approval came from his troops. They piled the ornate furniture, desks, and priceless books from the library, which included Thomas Jefferson's personal collection, into a giant bonfire in the center of the hall. The flames erupted with a ferocious roar, consuming the very words and laws that formed the foundation of the Republic. Soon, the immense heat cracked the stone columns and melted the glass in the skylights, sending the dome crashing down in a shower of sparks and embers. From the Capitol, the British marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. Their destination? The President's mansion. Upon arrival, the soldiers found a scene of uncanny domesticity. The table was still set for 40. The wine was still chilled. For the weary, dust-covered redcoats who had marched all day under a brutal sun, it was an irresistible sight. General Ross, maintaining a sliver of decorum, forbade looting of private property. But the president's house was considered state property, and therefore, fair game. The soldiers burst in, whooping and laughing. They devoured the feast intended for the American commanders, swilling the president's fine Madeira wine directly from the bottles. They ransacked the rooms, pocketing silver and other small valuables. Admiral Cockburn, in a final act of personal insult, reportedly found one of President Madison's hats and a cushion from Her Madison's chair, which he claimed as souvenirs to show his mother. After the impromptu feast, the order was given. Torches were prepared. Soldiers went from room to room, lighting the curtains, overturning furniture, and feeding the flames. The fire caught quickly, racing through the elegant mansion. The sandstone walls glowed a terrifying, demonic red against the night sky. The blaze was so intense that it could be seen from Baltimore, nearly 40 miles away. All through the night, the Capitol burned. The British systematically targeted every symbol of the American government. The Treasury Department was set ablaze, its financial records turning to ash. The War Office followed. The offices of the National Intelligencer, a newspaper that had been critical of the British, were personally ordered destroyed by Admiral Cockburn. "Be sure that all the seas are destroyed, so that they can no longer vilify my name," he allegedly joked. For the residents of Washington hiding in their homes or watching from the hills of Georgetown, it was a night of pure terror. The sky was not dark, but a flickering, hellish orange. The air was thick with the stench of burning wood, paper, and plaster. The crackle of the flames was punctuated by the occasional crash of a collapsing roof, or the detonation of munitions at the nearby Navy Yard, which had been set alight by the Americans themselves to prevent its capture. This was not just the burning of a city. It was the attempted immolation of an idea. It was a message, written in fire and smoke. Your nation is a failure, your government is powerless, and your capital is a ruin.
The Storm of Providence. As the fires raged into the early hours of August 25th, the sky, which had been clear, began to change. The oppressive heat and the immense energy released by the conflagrations created a volatile atmospheric cocktail. The wind began to whip through the ruined streets, and the orange glow of the fires was suddenly illuminated by flashes of lightning. Then, the heavens opened. A storm of almost supernatural intensity descended upon Washington. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid, blinding sheets. A torrential downpour, far more powerful than any summer squall, began to douse the flames. What the British had so methodically set alight, nature was now extinguishing. But the rain was only part of it. The storm spawned a tornado, a rare and terrifying event for the region. The funnel cloud tore a path directly through the center of the city, right where the British troops were bivouacked. The soldiers, veterans of European warfare who faced cannon and cavalry without flinching, were utterly terrified by the violent American weather. The tornado's winds were strong enough to lift cannons off their carriages and send them flying. Roofs were torn from houses, and several British soldiers were killed by collapsing buildings and flying debris. One British chronicler later wrote, "More of our men were killed by this cyclone than by all the fire of the American army." General Ross and Admiral Cockburn, seeing their men scattered and unnerved, and with the fires largely extinguished by the deluge, knew it was time to leave. The storm had broken not just the fires, but their will to remain in the smoldering capital. Under the cover of the raging tempest, the British army began its hasty, sodden retreat back to their ships on the Patuxentine River. The dawn of resilience. The morning of August 26th broke over a scene of utter devastation. President Madison returned to a city that looked like a classical ruin. The capital was a blackened, skeletal shell. The president's mansion was a hollowed-out husk, its proud white walls scorched black and gray, open to the sky. The interiors were gone, reduced to a pile of charred rubble in the basement. All that remained were the fire-stained exterior walls. The humiliation was profound. The government was in exile, meeting in temporary quarters. Many in Congress argued for abandoning the city altogether, for moving the capital to a safer, more established location like Philadelphia or New York. The burning of Washington, they argued, was proof that this swampy, vulnerable city was a failed experiment. But a powerful sentiment began to emerge from the ashes: resilience. To abandon Washington now would be to hand the British the very moral victory they had sought. To flee would be to admit defeat. Figures like Madison argued passionately that the capital must be rebuilt, right here, on these very foundations. It would be a testament to the nation's endurance. And so the work began. The architect, James Madison, who had originally designed the president's mansion, was brought back to oversee its reconstruction. A popular myth arose that the building was painted white to cover the scorch marks, and that this is when it earned its moniker, the White House. In truth, the building had been whitewashed since its construction, but the new coat of paint on the fire-scarred walls became a powerful symbol of renewal and rebirth. The blackened stone was not hidden, but transformed. The scar became a badge of honor. The burning of Washington was a national disgrace, a low point in American history. Yet, paradoxically, it became a crucial turning point. The blatant destruction of civilian and government buildings, rather than breaking the American spirit, galvanized it. It turned a divisive and unpopular war into a fight for national survival. The image of the burned-out Capitol and President's Mansion fueled a new wave of patriotism and resolve. Just a few weeks later, at the Battle of Baltimore, American defenders would withstand a fierce British bombardment, a victory that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem that would become the national anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner. The night the White House burned was a night of terror, destruction, and humiliation, but it was not an ending. It was a trial by fire, from which the young nation and its most iconic building emerged stronger, more determined, and forever marked by the memory of the flames. The blackened stones of 1814 became the bedrock of a capital and a country that refused to die.